Hi everyone, you are viewing the Cloud Rangers Microsoft Azure training. I'm Sean Ismail, a cloud architect with To Lead, and that's my contact information there. My Twitter is at Sean Ismail. The email is sean@cloudranger.net, and if you wish to connect professionally, that's my LinkedIn information. Feel free to connect and we can have a chat. Today is part 5 of Azure Cloud Services, and we are going to talk about, in particular, the cloud services caching. And I'm not going to have a lot of hands-on demo in this session. There's going to be some, but not a lot of, because caching tends to be one of those topics where you are now going, how Microsoft started calling DevOps. So this is more of a dev thing. The developer will be working on apps, roles, and things like that, and exploiting or utilizing the cache feature through codes or some programming to make use of it. So I'm going to go enough in depth to provide information on what caching is, what kind of caching are there in Azure, especially and a specific type of caching that we'll be addressing in this session, and how to configure it. So if you are one of those infrastructure people, this should be pretty relatively straightforward for you to do after this session. Okay, so we are not going to look into coding or anything and how to utilize this cache and how to recall the cache and any operations on the cache specifically through coding. We're not going to do that. So this will turn out to be a little bit of a conceptual type of a session, but definitely it's important for your exams as well as production work. So let's get started. So the specific type of cache that we are going to talk about is the Azure in-role cache. And before we get to that, let's talk about why do we need caching. Some of you might know this right away. Caching is all about enhancing or increasing performance, right? And in Azure, there's a lot of things that can be, there are a lot of things that are billable. So if you have any transaction, if you have a database transaction, those things are billable. So through the use of a cache, you can reduce costs and increase performance in Azure. And that's what we are trying to do with caching in cloud services. So Azure platform, like the entire Microsoft Azure platform, has three different types of caching options. Okay, there's in-role cache, managed cache, and Redis cache. The one that we are going to address in the session is the in-role cache because it's related to cloud services. So it's in-role cache is actually part of the cloud service, and that's why we're going to discuss this since this is a topic on cloud services, obviously. So it's called in-role cache because this caching is done or it is located in the memory of the cloud service roles. And why is that? Well, think about what a role specifically is in cloud service. It's actually nothing but an instance or it's a VM. It's a virtual machine. In the backend, that's what it is. A worker role or web role is a virtual machine. So we already knew that. What will happen is that you are going to utilize one of those virtual machines' memory, some of its memory, to store the cache information in. Okay, that's why it's called in role cache. It's in the role, and it's pretty unique because it's going to utilize memory in certain ways, and we'll get into details later on this. If you have multiple instances of a role, which we can have, and if the in-role cache is enabled, it'll actually form a cache cluster. Okay, so let's get to that in a bit. So if you look at this diagram over here that I have over here, it's a cloud service with a web role and two worker role. Okay, so let me grab my pointer here. So let's think of this as a virtual machine, and this part is the memory. Okay, so if the red part is the memory, the green part is actually where we have allocated the cache to reside in this memory. Okay, so I'm just giving a pictorial, description of how the memory is utilized to store the cache information so you can visualize better. So all these roles or these virtual machines, to so to speak, will be using the memory to store the cache information, and that's what makes it in role. Okay. So we'll be discussing three concepts, and the first thing is the cache cluster, the second one is named cache, and the third one is cache client. So if we discuss these three concepts, you'll get a total understanding of what's happening here. Okay, so let's talk about cache cluster. I briefly talked about it, but a cache cluster is actually formed when the role has multiple instances. And when you have multiple instances of a role and you enable the cache, it will form a cache cluster. Because now, for example, you have three roles. For example, let's take three web roles, and you're enabling the cache, and you're saying how much of memory you are going to utilize of each of these virtual machines to store the cache information in. You're creating a cluster because all three roles will actually have that information or will share that information. It almost forms a distributed caching service because you're not storing the cache just in one location. There are three instances in our example, so you could be storing it in any one of those instances there, right? So it's a distributed caching service, okay? And it forms one cache cluster in this single instance, okay? So let's move on to the next thing. There are two main deployment topologies when it comes to caching or in-role caching in cloud services in Azure. The first one is a co-located role. So if you have a co-located role for the caching, what you are doing is that actually, you know what? Let's take our example. Let's say that we have a web role here. Let's take just this web role here. If you have co-located caching, you are going to utilize, for example, these three instances or these three roles. One is web role and two worker roles. You are using the roles memory to some of the roles memory to store the cache, which is the green colored one, and you are letting the red colored memory for the role itself. So the web role has its own things to do. The worker role has its own things to do. You are just telling that, hey, if you have, for example, 1 gig of memory, I'm going to use like 256 megs of memory for caching, and you can use everything else for your own work. So you are sort of coexisting with the role, and that's why it's called co-located role. The cache is actually sharing resources with the roles, and in this case, we're talking about the memory, right? The next deployment topology is a dedicated role. In a dedicated role, you are creating a role in the cloud service, but you are only using that role or that virtual machine for cache purposes. So look at the second diagram here. We have a web role and a worker role, and I have another two worker roles over here. And as you can see, I'm using the entire memory over here exclusively for doing caching work. And the reason you'd actually do something like this is like if you have a very high demand web application where a lot of information needs to be cached and you find out you have like thousands of users, it might be worthwhile to actually have dedicated roles with caching completely enabled on that, and those roles do nothing but caching. Okay, it depends again the kind of performance you're looking for, the kind of load you're looking for. So that's one of the scenarios where you might want dedicated caching. Once again, you'd have other roles in your web service, obviously, to do other things. But just that in this scenario, dedicated scenario, these roles will do nothing but caching. Obviously, on the top over here, the co-located, they'll do caching and they'll do other stuff as well, their own specific workloads. Okay. The thing you have to remember for dedicated role, very important for exam, is that you can only do dedicated role on the worker roles. So you cannot make a web role a dedicated instance for caching. So that's something you have to remember, okay? In our previous example, when it was a co-located, we did not care which virtual machine or which role the cache was being stored in. Okay, so this is one primary difference between the co-located role and the dedicated role that you have to remember. The other thing I want to touch base with over here is now that you have caching enabled on these roles, what exactly you have to do to store information or retrieve information. Well, like I mentioned, your app developer will actually be using programming, coding, or whatever you call it to utilize this feature. So if you have cache enabled and they need to store information in the cache, they will do it programmatically, right? And they will retrieve information with their programs as well. So the way this will work is your application will completely be um, it, it it will completely be oblivious of where exactly the cache is stored. I mean, if you are going to do a co-located or a dedicated role, doesn't matter how many virtual machines it's going to be spread on, your application is going to be oblivious of that. It's not going to be aware of how that is done, and which makes it pretty unique because you don't have to worry about the back end and go into specifics on which machine to store this. As long as the feature is there, it will work. Okay, so you'll have to remember that it's all done in the application level to utilize this cache. So the cache cluster, which is obviously it becomes a cluster when you have multiple instances where the caching is enabled on. A cache cluster will have a bunch of configuration stuff or cache settings. And these settings are actually not stored on the machine itself, or the roles or the virtual machines itself. These cache settings are stored in a storage account. And through that, you can store all the different kind of settings in that storage account, and it can be applied to various roles or virtual machines, depending on how you configure it. So there are a bunch of settings, and this I've mentioned that over here you have a config store connection string, you have a cache size percentage, diagnostic level, client to diagnostic level, and you have named cache. So there are a bunch of settings that are there where which you can configure, and these are related directly to your cache. So for example, the config store connection string is actually a connection string to the Azure storage account where you are basically storing the cache account settings. So that kind of makes sense. Then you have the cache size percentage. What you're basically doing in the cache size percentage is you are going to specify how much, what, like the percentage of the role instance memory or the virtual machine's memory you're going to use for the cache. So in our previous example, when we are in the co-located mode, we were using 256 megs of a 1 gig memory on the VM. So you can specify that over there, that how many percent it's going to be. Then you have the diagnostic level, and diagnostic level is, it's basically the logging level. You want to see all the events that are happening on the cache, so you can enable various level, actually up to 5 levels, 0 to 4, where different, I mean, it will be based on different verbosity on the kind of logs that's going to be stored in there. And then you have the client diagnostic level as well. And then you have the named cache. Named cache is actually um, a very interesting thing, and that I'll provide some information on the demo. Your named cache is something that is a part of your cache cluster. So your cache cluster can have one or more named cache. And each of this named cache can have its own settings. Okay, the thing that you have to remember is that by default, when you have a cache cluster, there's already a named cache created, and it's called default. So remember that for exams and production work, that there is always a named cache. The reason we call it named cache is because you're giving it a name. So this cache will actually have a name. And what you're going to do is that your developer should be able to access this caches through his or her program and store information in there. So you could have one cache for storing some serializable objects, and the cache to store some, I don't know, video objects and stuff like that. So named cache is an important feature or an important thing of the cache cluster. So let's actually talk a little bit in details about the named cache. So The first thing, and I'll repeat again, that each cache cluster will it will have at least one cache, and it's called the default. Okay, so it will already have one made for you. Additional named cache can be added to the cluster, and each cache can have its own different configuration. Okay, so I was talking about the different settings that the named cache can have, and those are the settings. You can have name for the named cache. That's the most important one. High availability, like how much of this is highly available for the caching. Notifications, eviction policy, expiration, and TDL, or the time to leave. So these are the things I will actually go over when I'm actually going to go through the demo. Okay. Cache capacity is probably going to be one of the most important things among all this after you have actually created or enabled the caching and created your named cache, because you have to understand, based on some sort of performance or stress analysis or some sort of feedback from your users or your developers, on how much of caching you will need for that specific application. And there's no magic formula for this, because it will depend on the kind of web application you have, the kind of resources that go in the web page or web application, and it's something that's totally unique to your situations and your web application. Okay, so cache capacity is obviously determined on based on many factors, and um, reads rise to cache, and you have to like there's a bunch of factors you have to go through. So Microsoft provides this interesting document. It's a spreadsheet like an Excel, which you can go to this link and get from. And what you can do is you can use that as a template to understand how much of caching or what the cache capacity is going to be in your scenario. Okay, so feel free to look at this document and keep it as a resource if you are going to do some architecting of caching in Azure's cloud services. The last topic I want to talk about is the cache clients. And like I mentioned, cache client basically means that it's any application or a piece of code that stores or retrieves items from a cache cluster. It's very simple. Like your cache client might be your web app itself, or a small part or a small piece of code in your web application that's accessing or writing to the cache cluster. It's a terminology that you have to understand uh, quite carefully, because you have to know what your cache clients are going to be to create the different kinds of cache that you're going to have. Like I mentioned, you could have multiple named caches, so you have to understand which cache client is utilizing which named cache to store or to retrieve information from. So that's all the concepts I have for today's session, and I'm going to go jump into Visual Studio, where I'm going to create a couple of roles and show you what the settings are, so you can start tweaking or playing with it. Um, I'm not going to actually have a cache client, which is an application or a piece of code, to actually demonstrate how to do that, because that goes a little bit beyond the topic, a little bit out of the realms of what we are trying to achieve here in this session. Okay, but if you're a developer, you should go and look into MSDN resources and see how to write the code for cache clients to pull up the cache. And I'll show you a quick example as well on how that like how the code looks like. Okay, so let's go to Visual Studio over here. Alrighty, I am at my client computer. Let's go ahead and jump and create a project real fast here. Um, you guys should already be able to do this if you viewed my previous sessions, or you can just do one whatever way you create yours all the time. I'm not going to do much over here. Um, I'm going to add like a web role and a couple of worker roles maybe. Actually, two web roles. Let's do two web roles. Alrighty, I am going to put the name Ranger before all my roles here. It's easy for me to identify stuff that I have created. Alrighty, click OK. empty one. That should do it. Alrighty. So we have created that, and you can see my roles over here: Ranger, Web Role 1, Web Role 2, Worker Role 1, Worker Role 2. So let's go ahead and actually enable caching on one of these roles. Let's go to Properties here, right click and go to Properties here for Ranger Web Role 1. And in the configuration over here, I mean, for the properties of the web role here, you can see on the left-hand side, there's something called as caching. It's as simple as coming and click on this enable caching, and you can see everything else opens up over here. If you recall that when we enable caching, there's a bunch of settings. One of them was the percentage of the total memory. So since this is a co-located role, it's actually asking you that how much of that role's memory do you want to use for cache. I'm going to say I'm going to use about 30. And how much memory do I have in this role or this virtual machine? You can actually go up to configuration over here, and you can see that I have chosen the role's virtual machine size to be one core, about whatever, like 1792 megabytes of RAM total. And out of that, I'm saying 30% of that is going to be dedicated for my caching. Okay, this is not a dedicated role; it's co-located, so they are sharing resources. Now, obviously, you can see over here that you cannot click on the dedicated role. And why is that? Well, you cannot have dedicated role on a web role. It is only enabled on a worker role. So if you go to worker role over here and go to properties and go to caching here, enable caching, you can now actually see its dedicated role. The second you click on dedicated role, you can see this percentage slider actually gets disabled, because in dedicated role, you're not sharing resources. This entire Ranger worker role 2 will become dedicated for caching. Okay, so let's leave that like that. Come to our worker role over here. I mean, our web role here. We're going to do co-located. Now, if you remember, we wanted to do the named cache settings, right? So by default, there is a default named cache, and that's the name, default. And it has a bunch of settings over here. If it's going to be highly available, eviction policy, like how the cache is going to be working, okay? This named cache, like it mentions over here, it's like a logical name of caches with their own sort of individual policies. So you can use your application to actually access this named cache and store information. And depending on the kind of information you're putting over there, it will actually go and it will go and create the cache and utilize that cache based on that policy. Okay, so let's talk about one over here. Let's create add a named cache, and I'm going to just call this one a once again something with ranger named cache. And what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to have my eviction policy as LRU, which is basically means least recently used. I'm going to change this one to none. Okay, so over here, what I just did is I created two kinds of caching with different policies. Eviction policy, the one I just changed over here, it's basically a policy about how you're going to delete items in the cache when the cache approaches its capacity, right? I mean, each cache will have some sort of a capacity, and in this one, we are saying that anytime the cache reaches the capacity, which is over our case 30%, start deleting stuff. And the way the default will work is that default will not have any eviction policy, so it will always be the way it is. With ranger named cache, if you store anything in this cache, it's going to be least recently used, or LRU, means that whatever has not been used in the last few, whatever time, it's going to start deleting, because it's going to say that, hey, you probably don't need to cache this information because you're not really using it. Okay, so you can actually have those settings over here. You can add many named caches over here as well. So let's remove this one. We're going to just have this too. And your application is going to, you know, depending on the kind of resources you have there, it's going to access this to read and write. So when you have all the settings that you created over here, it's actually written in the service configuration file. If you remember what service configuration file was, right? So let's open this up, and you can actually see it went and created some settings under the configuration settings. Okay, so the settings that we created, you remember the settings that were there for this cache was diagnostic level, connection string, cache size percentage. So this is basically part of the service configuration file now. So in our Ranger web role, this was the information that we had created. It's going to be 30%. It's going to use some sort of a connection string and all the information here. For a worker role, obviously you can see some of this information over here is, well, the cache percentage is obviously missing because it's going to be dedicated and it's done that way. So any setting you do in the caching for the properties of these roles are reflected on the service configuration file. Okay, so that's important to remember for your for your exam. So let's go to properties here. I want to show you one more thing. Over here, when we are creating the named cache, there's something for high availability. So high availability will ensure that your cache has some sort of a high availability in case something's supposed to have to one your instance of your role. So if over here you come over here, and by the way, the things were over here, if you try to do range and cache, you want to enable high availability, you can actually see that it's throwing you a message over here that says that you require a role instance to be at least greater than one, because you just have one role with this, and it's not going to do anything, because there's nothing else to have high availability on, because you're not having more than one instance. The way you deal with that is actually you would create more than one instance for this role, and that's when this will actually work out, because now you have more than one instance, so it's highly available. So as usual, when you do all of that, you are going to have, everything reflects over here in the service configuration file. Okay, so remember that for your exam. I do want to show you a link. That's all for the demo, by the way. I want to show you a link where this is the URL. It actually talks a little bit about in-role cache for Azure Cache. And I want to show you here how they're using C# to actually, you know, access and put some information in the cache. You can see that there was a named cache over here. It's called name cache one. So it was one of the, let's come over here. It was one of the named cache you had created. In our case, it would be Ranger named cache. So you'd put Ranger named cache, or you'll have the default. These are the new data caches, and then you are doing cache.put, and you are actually putting some information in that cache to be, in the cache to be cached. So if you're a developer, this will actually make more sense. And we are not going to go and do this, but I just wanted to show that how you can use cache client or a piece of code to actually access, to put and retrieve information from the cache you just enabled. Okay. So that concludes our session for today. It's a nice short session for cloud services caching. We talked about what caching was used for and the kind of caching Azure has. Um, we talked about three different topics where we are talking about, the cache cluster. We talked about the named caches. We talked about cache client. We talked about the different configurations that are in there. Then we went to Visual Studio and we saw how you can have the different topologies on the dedicated or co-located that you can have on your roles, and the configuration that you can do from Visual Studio to write to the service configuration file to configure the caching. Okay, so it's a nice and short session, very conceptual for sure. As a developer, you can probably do much more, but as an ops or infrastructure person, you can only do so much with this caching. After that, the developers are the only ones who can get to have fun on that. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our session. Let's talk about our information here. Training site, it's on cloudranger.net/Azure-training. You are viewing this on YouTube at Cloud Ranger Network channel. Twitter is at Sean Ismail, email sean@cloudranger.net, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Um, I have mentioned this many times before. A lot of you email me thanking me for what I'm trying to do, and some of you have a lot of questions, and I try to answer them when I have some time, but sometimes I do fall back a little bit answering those questions over the email. So it takes some time, so apologies for that. Um, my request is that if you can actually have a question posted on the YouTube comments, it's probably much easier because there are other people who might have similar questions like you do. So I keep emphasizing that I have no problem if you email me, but if you can actually put that on YouTube comments, that actually would help a lot of other people in similar scenarios. And you know what? Maybe somebody else will answer that for you if I'm not around. Everybody's learning here, including myself. Somebody else might know that or chime in or provide more feedback. A lot of people do watch this channel, so it might help. And do not forget to subscribe and like the videos. And I would like to thank you for viewing. I'll see you in the next session.